This is a Vivekananda Kendra Kanyakumari recording. All recordings of Vivekananda Kendra are in the public domain. For more information and also to volunteer, please visit www.vkendra.org. My India, the India Eternal by Swami Vivekananda. Read by Noyana Chatterjee. Chapter 6. True Religion.
Definition of religion and its true form. Religion is the idea which is raising the brute unto man, and man unto God. There is one impulse in our mind which says, do. Behind it rises another voice which says, do not. There is one set of ideas in our mind which is always struggling to get outside through the channels of the senses. And behind that, although it may be thin and weak, there is an infinitely small voice which says, "Do not go outside." The two beautiful Sanskrit words for these phenomena are pravritti and nivritti, circling forward and circling inward. Religion begins with this, do not. Spirituality begins with this, do not. When the do not is not there, religion has not begun. Each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal. Do this either by work or worship or psychic control or philosophy. By one or more or all of these and be free. This is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. Religion is the manifestation of the divinity already in man. Religion is not in books, not in theories, not in dogmas, nor in talking, not even in reasoning. It is being and becoming. My friends, until each one of you has become a rishi and come face to face with spiritual facts, religious life has not begun for you. Until the superconscious opens for you, religion is mere talk. It is nothing but preparation. You are talking second hand, third hand. Above all, there is another thing to remember, which I am sorry we forget from time to time, that religion in India means realization and nothing short of that. Believe in the doctrine and you are safe can never be taught to us, for we do not believe in that. You are what you make yourself. You are by the grace of God and your own exertions what you are. Mere believing in certain theories and doctrines will not help you much. The mighty word that came out from the sky of spirituality in India was Anubhuti, realization. And ours are the only books which declare again and again, the Lord is to be seen. Bold, brave words indeed, but true to their very core. Every sound, every vibration is true. Religion is to be realized, not only heard. It is not in learning some doctrines like a parrot. Neither it is mere intellectual assent. That is nothing. But it must come into us. And therefore the greatest proof that we have of the existence of a God is not because our reason says so, but because God has been seen by the ancients as well as by the moderns. Try to be pure and unselfish. That is the whole of religion. The secret of religion lies not in theories, but in practice. To be good and to do good, that is the whole of religion. Unselfishness is God. One may live on a throne in a golden palace and be perfectly unselfish, and then he is in God. Another may live in a hut and wear rags and have nothing in the world, yet, if he is selfish, he is intensely merged in the world. Selfishness is the chief sin, thinking of ourselves first. He who thinks, I will eat first, I will have more money than others, and I will possess everything. He who thinks, I will get to heaven before others, I will get mukti before others, is the selfish man. The unselfish man says, I will be last. I do not care to go to heaven. I will even go to hell if by doing so I can help my brothers. This unselfishness is the test of religion. He who has more of this unselfishness is more spiritual and nearer to Shiva. Virtue is that which tends to our improvement, and vice to our degeneration. Man is made up of three qualities: brutal, human, and godly. That which tends to increase the divinity in you is virtue, and that which tends to increase brutality in you is vice. You must kill the brutal nature and become human, that is, loving and charitable. You must transcend that too and become pure bliss, Satchidananda, fire without burning, wonderfully loving, but without the weakness of human love, without the feeling of misery. If a religion cannot help man wherever he may be, wherever he stands, it is not of much use. It will remain only a theory for the chosen few. Religion, to help mankind, must be ready and able to help him in whatever condition he is in servitude or in freedom, in the depths of degradation or on the heights of purity, everywhere, equally, it should be able to come to his aid. Anything that brings spiritual, mental, or physical weakness, touch it not with the toes of your feet. Religion is the manifestation of the natural strength that is in man. A spring of infinite power is coiled up and is inside this little body, and that spring is spreading itself. And as it goes on spreading, body after body is found insufficient. It throws them off and takes higher bodies. This is the history of man, of religion, civilization, or progress. Ways to God. There are 4 general types of men: the rational, the emotional, the mystical, and the worker. For each of these we must provide suitable forms of worship. There comes the rational man who says, I care not for this form of worship. Give me the philosophical, the rational, that I can appreciate. So for the rational man is the rational philosophic worship. There comes the worker. He says, I care not for the worship of the philosopher. Give me work to do for my fellow men. So for him is provided work as the path of worship. As for the mystical and the emotional, we have their respective modes of devotion. All these men have, in religion, the elements of their faith. The ultimate goal of all mankind, the aim and end of all religion, is but one: reunion with God, or what amounts to the same with the divinity which is every man's true nature. But while the aim is one, the method of attaining may vary with the different temperaments of men. Both the goal and the methods employed for reaching it are called yoga, a word derived from the name Sanskrit root as the English yoke, meaning to join us to our reality, God. There are various such yogas or methods of union, but the chief ones are Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. Every man must develop according to his own nature. As every science has its method, so has every religion. The methods of attaining the end of religion are called yoga by us, and the different forms of yoga that we teach are adapted to the different natures and temperaments of men. We classify them in the following way under 4 heads. 1. Karma Yoga. The manner in which a man realizes his own divinity through works and duty. 2. Bhakti Yoga. The realization of the divinity through devotion to and love of a personal God. 3. Raja Yoga. The realization of the divinity through the control of mind. And 4. Jnana Yoga. the realization of man's own divinity through knowledge. These are all different roads leading to the same center, God. Jnana, Bhakti, Yoga, and Karma. These are the four paths which lead to salvation. One must follow the path for which one is best suited. But in this age, special stress should be laid on Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. You must always remember that the one central idea of Vedanta is this oneness. There are no two in anything, no two lives, nor even two different kinds of life for the two worlds. There is but one life, one world, one existence. Everything is that one. The difference is in degree and not in kind. The amoeba and I are the same. The difference is only in degree. And from the standpoint of the highest life, all these differences vanish. No perfection is going to be attained. You are already free and perfect. What are these ideas of religion and God and searching for the hereafter? Why does man look for a God? Why does man in every nation, in every state of society, wants a perfect ideal somewhere, either in man, in God, or elsewhere? Because that idea is within you. It was your own heart beating and you did not know. You were mistaking it for something external. It is the God within your own self that is propelling you to seek for Him, to realize Him. After long searches here and there, in temples and in churches, in earths and in heavens, at last you come back, completing the circle from where you started to your own soul, and find that He, for whom you have been seeking all over the world, for whom you have been weeping and praying in churches and temples, on whom you were looking as the mystery of all mysteries shrouded in the clouds, is nearest of the near, is your own self, the reality of your life, body and soul. That is your own nature. Assert it, manifest it. Not to become pure, you are pure already. You are not to be perfect. You are that already. Nature is like that screen which is hiding the reality beyond. Every good thought that you think or act upon is simply tearing the veil, as it were, and the purity, the infinity, the God behind, manifests itself more and more. The solution of the Vedanta is that we are not bound, we are not free already. Not only so, but to say or to think that we are bound is dangerous. It is a mistake. It is self-hypnotism. As soon as you say, I am bound, I am weak, I am helpless, woe unto you. You rivet one more chain upon yourself. Do not say it. Do not think it. It is weakness, says the Vedanta, which is the cause of all misery in this world. Weakness is the one cause of suffering. We become miserable because we are weak. We lie, steal, kill, and commit other crimes because we are weak. We suffer because we are weak. We die because we are weak. Where there is nothing to weaken us, there is no death nor sorrow. We are miserable through delusion. Give up the delusion, and the whole thing vanishes. My idea is to show that the highest ideal of morality and unselfishness goes hand in hand with the highest metaphysical conception, and that you need not lower your conception to get ethics and morality, but on the other hand, to reach a real basis of morality and ethics, you must have the highest philosophical and scientific conceptions. Human knowledge is not antagonistic to human well-being. On the contrary, it is knowledge alone that will save us in every department of life. In knowledge is worship. The more we know, the better for us. The Vedantist says, the cause of all that is apparently evil is the limitation of the unlimited. The love which gets limited into little channels and seems to be evil eventually comes out at the other end and manifests itself as God. The Vedanta also says that the cause of all this apparent evil is in ourselves. Do not blame any supernatural being, neither be hopeless and despondent, nor think we are in a place from which we can never escape unless someone comes and lends us a helping hand. That cannot be, says the Vedanta. But help does not come from without. It comes from within ourselves. Cry to all the gods in the universe. I cried for years. And in the end I found that I was helped. But help came from within. And I had to undo what I had done by mistake. That is the only way. I had to cut the net which I had thrown round myself, and the power to do this is within. Of this I am certain that not one aspiration, well guided or ill guided in my life, has been in vain, but that I am the resultant of all my past, both good and evil. I have committed many mistakes in my life, but mark you, I am sure of this, that without every one of those mistakes, I should not be what I am today, and so am quite satisfied to have made them. I do not mean that you are to go home and willfully commit mistakes. Do not misunderstand me in that way. But do not mock because of all the mistakes you have committed, but know that in the end all will come out straight. It cannot be otherwise, because goodness is our nature, purity is our nature, and that nature can never be destroyed. Our essential nature always remains the same. Take the idea of sin. I was telling you just now the Vedantic idea of it, and the other idea is that man is a sinner. They are practically the same. Only the one takes the positive and the other takes the negative side. One shows to man his strength and the other his weakness. There may be weakness, says the Vedanta, but never mind, we want to grow. Disease was found out as soon as man was born. Everyone knows his disease. It requires no one to tell us what our diseases are. But thinking all the time that we are diseased will not cure us. Medicine is necessary. We may forget anything outside, we may try to become hypocrites to the external world. But in our heart of hearts, we all know our weakness. But, says the Vedanta, being reminded of weakness does not help much. Give strength. And strength does not come by thinking of weakness all the time. The remedy for weakness is not brooding over weakness, but thinking of strength. Teach men of the strength that is already within them. Instead of telling them they are sinners, the Vedanta takes the opposite position and says, you are pure and perfect, and what you call sin does not belong to you. Sins are very low degrees of self-manifestation. Manifest yourself in a high degree. That is the one thing to remember. All of us can do that. Never say no. Never say I cannot, for you are infinite. Even time and space are as nothing compared with your nature. You can do anything and everything. You are almighty. Two forces have been working side by side in parallel lines. The one says, I, the other says, not I. Their manifestation is not only in man but in animals. Not only in animals but in the smallest worms. The tigress that plunges her fangs into the warm blood of a human being would give up her own life to protect her young. The most depraved man who thinks nothing of taking the lives of his brother men will, perhaps, sacrifice himself without any hesitation to save his starving wife and children. Thus, throughout creation, these two forces are working side by side. Where you find the one, you find the other too. The one is selfishness, the other is unselfishness. The one is acquisition, the other is renunciation. The one takes, the other gives. From the lowest to the highest, the whole universe is the playground of these two forces. It does not require any demonstration. It is obvious to all. What right has any section of the community to base the whole work and evolution of the universe upon one of these two factors alone, upon competition and struggle? What right has it to base the whole working of the universe upon passion and fight, upon competition and struggle? That these exist, we do not deny. But what right has anyone to deny the working of the other force? Can any man deny that love, this not I, this renunciation is the only positive power in the universe? The other is only the misguided employment of the power of love. The power of love brings competition. The real genesis of competition is in love. The real genesis of evil is in unselfishness. The creator of evil is good, and the end is also good. It is only misdirection of the power of good. A man who murders another is perhaps moved to do so by the love of his own child. His love has become limited to that one little baby, to the exclusion of the millions of other human beings in the universe. Yet, limited or unlimited, it is the same love. Thus, the motive power of the whole universe, in whatever way it manifests itself, is the one wonderful thing: unselfishness, renunciation, love, the real, the only living force in existence. Therefore, the Vedantist insists upon the oneness. Advaita. And Advaita alone explains morality. Every religion preaches that the essence of all morality is to do good to others. And why? Be unselfish. And why should I? Some God has said it? He is not for me. Some texts have declared it? Let them. That is nothing to me. Let them all tell it. And if they do, what is it to me? Each one for himself, and somebody take the hindermost. That is all the morality in the world, at least with many. What is the reason that I should be moral? You cannot explain it except when you come to know the truth as given in the Gita. He who sees everyone in himself and himself in everyone, thus seeing the same God living in all, he, the sage, no more kills the self by the self. Know through Advaita that whomsoever you hurt yourself. They are all you. Whether you know it or not, through all hands you work, through all feet you move, you are the king enjoying in the palace. You are the beggar leading that miserable existence in the street. You are in the ignorant as well as in the learned. You are in the man who is weak, and you are in the strong. Know this and be sympathetic. And that is why we must not hurt others. That is why I do not even care whether I have to starve, because there will be millions of mouths eating at the same time, and they are all mine. Therefore, I should not care what becomes of me and mine, for the whole universe is mine. I am enjoying all the bliss at the same time. And who can kill me or the universe? Herein is morality. Here, in Advaita alone, is morality explained. The others teach it, but cannot give you its reason. We as personalized, differentiated beings forget our reality. And the teaching of monism is not that we shall give up these differentiations, but we must learn to understand what they are. We are in reality that infinite being, and our personalities represent so many channels through which this infinite reality is manifesting itself. And the whole mass of changes which we call evolution is brought about by the soul trying to manifest more and more of its infinite energy. We cannot stop anywhere on this side of the infinite. Our power and blessedness and wisdom cannot but grow into the infinite. Infinite power and existence and blessedness are ours, and we have not to acquire them. They are our very own, and we have only to manifest them. This is the central idea of monism. Life is full of ills. The world is full of evils. That is a fact no one who is old enough to know the world can deny. But what is the remedy proposed by all the religions? That this world is nothing. Beyond this world is something which is very real. Here comes the difficulty. The remedy seems to destroy everything. Is there no way out then? The Vedanta says that what all the religions advance is perfectly true, but it should be properly understood. The Vedanta does not in reality denounce the world. The ideal of renunciation nowhere attains such a height as in the teachings of the Vedanta. But, at the same time, dry suicidal advice is not intended. It really means deification of the world. Giving up the world as we think of it, as we know it, as it appears to us, and to know what it really is, deify it. It is God alone. We read at the commencement of one of the oldest of the Upanishads, whatever exists in this universe is to be covered with the Lord. We have to cover everything with the Lord Himself, not by a false sort of optimism, not by blinding our eyes to the evil, but by really seeing God in everything. Thus, we have to give up the world, and then the world is given up. What remains? God. What is meant? You can have your wife. It does not mean that you are to abandon her, but that you are to see God in the wife. Give up your children. What does that mean? To turn them out of doors, as some human brutes do in every country? Certainly not. That is diabolism. It is not religion. But see God in your children. So, in everything, in life and in death, in happiness and in misery, the Lord is equally present. The whole world is full of the Lord. Open your eyes and see Him. Open your eyes and see that as such, it never existed. It was a dream, Maya. What existed was the Lord Himself. It is He who is in the child, in the wife, and in the husband. It is He who is in the good and in the bad. He is in the sin and in the sinner. He is in life and in death. Raja Yoga, the path of psychic control. The aim is to get rid of nature's control over us. That is the goal of all religion. The yogi tries to reach this goal through psychic control. Until we free ourselves from nature, we are slaves. As she dictates, so we must go. The yogi claims that he who controls mind controls matter also. The internal nature is much higher than the external and much more difficult to grapple with, much more difficult to control. Therefore, he who has conquered the internal nature controls the whole universe. It becomes his servant. Raja Yoga propounds the methods of gaining this control. The science of Raja Yoga, in the first place, proposes to give us such a means of observing the internal states. The instrument is the mind itself. The object is eternal. The mind itself is the object, and it is necessary to study the mind itself. Mind studying mind. We know that there is the power of the mind called reflection. You work and think at the same time. While a portion of your mind stands by and sees what you're thinking, the powers of the mind should be concentrated and turned back upon itself. And as the darkest places reveal their secrets before the penetrating rays of the sun, so will this concentrated mind penetrate its own innermost secrets. This is what Raja Yoga proposes to teach. The goal of all its teaching is how to concentrate the mind, then how to discover the innermost recesses of our own minds, then how to generalize their contents and form our own conclusion from them. A man feels that if he is unchaste, spirituality goes away. He loses mental vigor and moral stamina. That is why in all the religious orders in the world which have produced spiritual giants, you will always find absolute chastity insisted upon. That is why the monks came into existence, giving up marriage. There must be perfect chastity in thought, word, and deed. Without it, the practice of Raja Yoga is dangerous and may lead to insanity. If people practice Raja Yoga and at the same time lead an impure life, how can they expect to become yogis? Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. Bhakti is everywhere, whether directed to God or to noble persons. Upasana, in the form of bhakti, is everywhere supreme, and bhakti is more easily attained than jnana. The latter requires favorable circumstances and strenuous practice. Yoga cannot be properly practiced unless a man is physically very healthy and free from all worldly attachments. But bhakti can be more easily practiced by persons in every condition of life. It is not bhakti if we worship God with the desire for a son. It is not bhakti if we worship with the desire to be rich. It is not bhakti even if we have a desire for heaven. It is not bhakti if a man worships with the desire of being saved from the tortures of hell. Bhakti is not the outcome of fear or greediness. He is the true Bhagavata who says, "O God, I do not want a beautiful wife. I do not want knowledge or salvation. Let me be born and die hundreds of times. What I want is that I should be ever engaged in thy service." The bhakti of India is not like the Western bhakti. The central idea of ours is that there is no thought of fear. It is always love God. Bhakti is spoken of in the oldest of the Upanishads, which is much older than the Christian Bible. The germs of bhakti are even in the Samhita, the Vedic hymns. The word bhakti is not a Western word. It was suggested by the word Shraddha. The lowest form in which this love is appreciated is what they call the peaceful, the Shanta. When a man worships God without the fire of love in him, without its madness in his brain, when his love is just the calm, commonplace love, a little higher than more forms and ceremonies and symbols, but not at all characterized by the madness of intensely active love, it is said to be Shanta. We see some people in the world who like to move on slowly, and others who come and go like the whirlwind. The Shanta Bhakta is calm, peaceful, gentle. The next higher type is that of Dasya, that is, servantship. It comes when a man thinks he is the servant of the Lord, the attachment of the faithful servant unto the master in his ideal. The next type of love is Sakhya, friendship. Thou art our beloved friend. Just as a man opens his heart to his friend and knows that the friend will never chide him or his faults but will always try to help him, just as there is the idea of equality between him and his friend, so equal love flows in and out between the worshipper and his friendly God. Thus God becomes our friend, the friend who is near, the friend to whom we may freely tell all the tales of our lives. The next is what is known as Vatsalya, loving God not as our father but as our child. This may look peculiar, but it is a discipline to enable us to detach all ideas of power from the concept of God. The idea of power brings with it awe. There should be no awe in love. To conceive God as mighty, majestic, and glorious, as the Lord of the universe or as the God of gods, the lover says he does not care. It is to avoid this association with God of the fear-creating sense of power that he worships God as his own child. The mother and the father are not moved by awe in relation to the child. They cannot have any reverence for the child. They cannot think of asking any favor from the child. The child's position is always that of the receiver. And out of love for the child, the parents will give up their bodies 100 times over. 1,000 lives they will sacrifice for that one child of theirs. And therefore, God is loved as a child. There is one more human representation of the divine ideal of love. It is known as Madhura, sweet, and is the highest of all such representation. It is indeed based on the highest manifestation of love in this world, and this love is also the strongest known to man. What love shakes the whole nature of man? What love runs through every atom of his being, makes him mad, makes him forget his own nature, transforms him, makes him either a god or a demon, as the love between man and woman? In this sweet representation of divine love, God is our husband. We are all women. There are no men in this world. There is but one man, and that is He, our beloved. All that love which man gives to woman or woman to man has here to be given up to the Lord. A. The true spiritual lover does not rest even there. Even the love of husband and wife is not mad enough for him. The bhaktas take up also the idea of illegitimate love, because it is so strong, the impropriety of it not at all the thing they have in view. The nature of this love is such that the more obstructions there are for its free play, the more passionate it becomes. The love between husband and wife is smooth. There are no obstructions there. So the bhaktas take up the idea of a girl who is in love with her own beloved, and her mother or father or husband objects to such love. And the more anybody obstructs the course of her love, so much the more is her love tending to grow in strength. Human language cannot describe how Krishna, in the groves of Vrinda, was madly loved. How with the sound of his voice the ever-blessing gopis rushed out to meet him, forgetting everything, forgetting this world and its ties, its duties, its joys, and its sorrows. Man, oh man, you speak of divine love and at the same time are able to attend to all the vanities of this world. Are you sincere? Where Rama is, there is no room for any desire. Where desire is, there is no room for Rama. These never coexist, like light and darkness. They are never together. That love which a man has for his beloved can illustrate the love we ought to have for God. Krishna is the God, and Radha loves him. But how many understand this? How can people who are vicious to their very core and have no idea of what morality is understand all this? When people drive all sorts of worldly thoughts from their minds and live in a clear moral and spiritual atmosphere, it is then that they understand the abstrusest of thoughts, even if they are uneducated. But how few are there of that nature? There is bhakti within you. Only a veil of lust and wealth covers it. And as soon as that is removed, bhakti will manifest by itself. Love is great and noble, but it may die away in meaningless sentimentalism. The one great advantage of bhakti is that it is the easiest and the most natural way to reach the great divine end in view. Its great disadvantage is that in its lower forms it oftentimes degenerates into hideous fanaticism. Sri Chaitanya was a man of tremendous renunciation and had nothing to do with woman and carnal appetites. But in later times, his disciples admitted women into their order, mixed indiscriminately with them in his name, and made an awful mess of the whole thing. And the ideal of love, which the Lord exemplified in his life, was perfectly selfless and bereft of any vestige of lust. That sexless love can never be the property of the masses. But the subsequent Vaishnava gurus, instead of laying particular stress first on the aspect of renunciation in the master's life, bestowed all their zeal on preaching and infusing his ideal of love among the masses. And the consequence was that the common people could not grasp and assimilate that high ideal of divine love, and naturally made of it the worst form of love between man and woman. There can be no love so long as there is lust, even a speck of it, as it were, in the heart. None but men of great renunciation, none but mighty giants among men, have a right to that love divine. If that highest ideal of love is held out to the masses, it will indirectly tend to stimulate its worldly prototype which dominates the heart of man. For, meditating on love to God, by thinking of oneself as his wife or beloved, one would very likely be thinking most of the time of one's own wife. The result is too obvious to point out. Are there no other relationships by which to worship God except this Madhura idea of love? Why not follow the 4 other paths and take the name of the Lord with all your heart? Let the heart be open first, and all else will follow itself. But know this for certain, that prema cannot come while there is lust. Why not try to get rid of carnal desires? But don't think that kirtana means dancing only. It means singing the glories of God in whatever way that suits you. That vehement stirring up of feeling and the dancing of the Vaishnavas are good and very catching, no doubt. But there is also a danger in practicing them, from which you must save yourself. The danger lies here, in the reaction. On the one hand, the feeling are at once roused to the highest pitch, tears flow from your eyes, the heads reel as it were under intoxication. On the other hand, as soon as the Sankirtana stops, that mass of feeling sinks down as precipitately as it rose. The higher the wave rises on the ocean, the lower it falls, with equal force. It is very difficult at that stage to contain oneself against the shock of reaction, unless one has the proper discrimination. One is likely to succumb to the lower propensities of lust, etc. Worship God with bhakti, tempered with jnana. Keep the spirit of discrimination along with bhakti. Besides this, gather from Sri Chaitanya his heart, his loving kindness to all beings, his burning passion for God, and make his renunciation the ideal of your life. Karma Yoga, the path of action. The only true duty is to be unattached and to work as free beings, to give up all work unto God. All our duties are His. Any work, any action, any thought that produces an effect is called a karma. To work properly, therefore, you have first to give up the idea of attachment. Secondly, do not mix in the fray. Hold yourself as a witness and go on working. My master used to say, look upon your children as a nurse does. The nurse will take your baby and fondle it, play with it, and behave towards it as gently as if it were her own child. But as soon as you give her notice to quit, she is ready to start off bag and baggage from the house. Everything in the shape of attachment is forgotten. Even so are you to be with all that you consider your own. You are the nurse. And if you believe in God, believe that all these things which you consider yours are really His. Let us do good, because it is good to do good. He who does good work, even in order to get to heaven, binds himself down. Says the Karma Yogi. Any work that is done with any the least selfish motive, instead of making us free, forges one more chain for our feet. So the only way is to give up all the fruits of work, to be unattached to them. Every good work we do without any ulterior motive, instead of forging a new chain, will break one of the links in the existing chains. Every good thought that we send to the world without thinking of any return will be stored up there and break one link in the chain and make us purer and purer until we become the purest of mortals. Only that kind of work which develops our spirituality is work. Whatever fosters materiality is no work. In this human life, one cannot help doing some kind of work always. When man has perforce to do some work, Karma Yoga enjoins on him to do it in such a way as will bring freedom through the realization of the Atma. To attain liberation through work, join yourself to work, but without desire, looking for no result. Such work leads to knowledge, which in turn brings emancipation. To give up work before you know leads to misery. Work done for the self gives no bondage, neither desire pleasure nor fear pain from work. Do all as a sacrifice or offering to the Lord. Be in the world, but not of it. Like the lotus leaf whose roots are in the mud, but which remains always pure. Let your love go to all, whatever they do to you. If you have no eye to the fruits of work, and if you have a passionate longing to go beyond all selfish desires, then these good works will help to break your bonds, I tell you. How thoughtless of you to say that such work will lead to bondage. Such disinterested work is the only means of rooting out the bondage due to selfish work. There is no other way out. Sri Krishna ought to be painted as he really was, the Gita personified. And the central idea of the Gita should radiate from his whole form. Intense action in the whole body, and withal a face expressing the profound calmness and serenity of the blue sky. This is the central idea of the Gita. To be calm and steadfast in all circumstances, with one's body, mind and soul centered at his hallowed feet. Karmanya karmaya pashyedakmarni cha karmaya sabuddhi manam nushyeshu sayukta kritsna karma krit. He who even while doing action can keep his mind calm, and in whom, even when not doing any outward action, flows the current of activity in the form of the contemplation of Brahman, is the intelligent one among men. He indeed is the yogi. He indeed is the perfect worker. This idea must be preached to everyone. Work, work, endless work, without looking at results, and always keeping the whole mind and soul steadfast at the lotus feet of the Lord. The Tantrika form of worship is a very slippery ground. This province has had enough of the Tantra. Now it must go beyond. The Vedas should be studied. A harmony of the 4 kinds of yogas must be practiced, and absolute chastity must be preserved. Discrimination between the real and the unreal, dispassion and devotion, work and practices in concentration, and along with these, there must be a reverential attitude towards women. They are the representations of the Divine Mother. And real well-being of India will commence from the day that the worship of the Divine Mother will truly begin, and every man will sacrifice himself at the altar of the Mother. Harmony of religions. The greatest misfortune to befall the world would be if all mankind were to recognize and accept but one religion, one universal form of worship, one standard of morality. This would be the death blow to all religious and spiritual progress. Instead of trying to hasten this disastrous event by inducing persons through good or evil methods to conform to our highest ideals of truth, we ought rather to endeavor to remove all obstacles which prevent men from developing in accordance with their own highest ideals, and thus make their attempt vain to establish one universal religion. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. I am proud to belong to a nation which has sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions and all nations of the earth. We must not only tolerate others, but positively embrace them, and that truth is the basis of all religions. Condemn none. If you can stretch out a helping hand, do so. If you cannot, fold your hands, bless your brothers, and let them go their own way. Dragging down and condemning is not the way to work. Never is work accomplished in that way. We spend our energies in condemning others. Criticism and condemnation is a vain way of spending our energies. For in the long run, we come to learn that all are seeing the same thing, are more or less approaching the same ideal, and that most of our differences are merely differences of expression. Indeed, the varieties of religious belief are an advantage, since all faiths are good, so far as they encourage man to lead a religious life. The more sects there are, the more opportunities there are for making successful appeals to the divine instinct in all men. My master taught that religion is one. All prophets teach the same, but they can only present the principle in a form. So they take it out of the old form and put it before us in a new form. In all religions, the superconscious state is identical. Hindus, Christians, Mohammedans, Buddhists, and even those of no creed all have the very same experience when they transcend the body. The Christian is not to become a Hindu or a Buddhist, nor a Hindu or a Buddhist to become a Christian, but each must assimilate the spirit of the others and yet preserve his individuality and grow according to his own law of growth. Holiness, purity, and charity are not the exclusive possessions of any church in the world, and that every system has produced men and women of the most exalted character. In the face of this evidence, if anybody dreams of the exclusive survival of his own religion and the destruction of the others, I pity him from the bottom of my heart, and point out to him that upon the banner of every religion will soon be written, in spite of resistance, help and not fight, assimilation and not destruction, harmony and peace and not dissension. If there is ever to be a universal religion, it must be one which will have no location in place or time, which will be infinite like the God it will preach, and whose sun will shine upon the followers of Krishna and the Christ, on saints and sinners alike, which will not be Brahminic or Buddhistic, Christian or Mohammedan, but the sum total of all these, and still have infinite space for development, which in its Catholicity will embrace in its infinite arms and find a place for every human being, from the lowest groveling savage not far removed from the brute, to the highest man towering by the virtues of his head and heart and almost above humanity, making society stand in awe of him and doubt his human nature. It will be a religion which will have no place for persecution or intolerance in its polity, which will recognize divinity in every man and woman, and whose whole scope, whose whole force will be centered in aiding humanity to realize its own true divine nature. Offer such a religion, and all the nations will follow you. Characteristics of a spiritual man. The first sign that you are becoming religious is that you are becoming cheerful. When a man is gloomy, that may be dyspepsia, but it is not religion. Misery is caused by sin and by no other cause. If you have a clouded face, do not go out that day. Shut yourself up in your room. What right have you to carry this disease out into the world? The real spiritual man is broad everywhere. His love forces him to be so. Those to whom religion is a trade are forced to become narrow and mischievous by their introduction into religion of the competitive, fighting, and selfish methods of the world. Why do we see wickedness? We see the world as we are. Suppose there is a baby in a room with a bag of gold on the table, and a thief comes and steals the gold. Would the baby know it was stolen? That which we have inside, we see outside. The baby has no thief inside and sees no thief outside. So with all the knowledge, do not talk of the wickedness of the world and all its sins. Weep that you are bound to see wickedness yet. Weep that you are bound to see sin everywhere. And if you want to help the world, do not condemn it. Do not weaken it more. For what is sin and what is misery? And what are all these but the results of weakness? The world is made weaker and weaker every day by such teachings. Men are taught from childhood that they are weak and sinners. Teach them that they are all glorious children of immortality. Even those who are the weakest in manifestation. Let positive, strong, helpful thoughts enter into their brains from very childhood. Lay yourselves open to these thoughts and not to weakening and paralyzing ones. Say to your own minds, I am He, I am He. Let it ring day and night in your minds like a song. And at the point of death declare, I am He. That is the truth. The infinite strength of the world is yours. Let us be brave. Know the truth and practice the truth. The goal may be distant, but awake. Arise and stop not till the goal is reached. Do you not know from the history of the world where the power of the prophets lay? Where was it? In the intellect? Did any of them write a fine book on philosophy? On the most intricate rationalization of logic? Not one of them. They only spoke a few words. Feel like Christ and you will be a Christ. Feel like Buddha and you will be a Buddha. It is feeling that is the life, the strength, the vitality, without which no amount of intellectual activity can reach God. There are two sorts of courage. One is the courage of facing the cannon, and the other is the courage of spiritual conviction. An emperor who invaded India was told by his teacher to go and see some of the sages there. After a long search for one, he found a very old man sitting on a block of stone. The emperor talked with him a little and became very impressed by his wisdom. He asked the sage to go to his country with him. No, said the sage, I'm quite satisfied with my forest here. Said the emperor, I'll give you money, position, wealth. I am the emperor of the world. No, replied the man, I don't care for those things. The emperor replied, If you do not go, I will kill you. The man smiled serenely and said, That is the most foolish thing you ever said, Emperor. You cannot kill me. Me the sun cannot dry. Fire cannot burn, sword cannot kill, for I am the birthless, the deathless, the ever-living, omnipotent, omnipresent Spirit. This is spiritual boldness, while the other is the courage of a lion or a tiger. In the mutiny of 1857, there was a Swami, a very great soul, whom a Muhammadan mutineer stabbed severely. The Hindu mutineers caught and brought the man to the Swami, offering to kill him. But the Swami looked up calmly and said, "My brother, thou art he, and expired." This is another instance. Worship of the living God. The secret of religion lies not in theories but in practice. To be good and to do good, that is the whole of religion. Not he that crieth, "Lord, Lord," but he that doeth the will of the Father. Be moral, be brave, be a heart-whole man, strictly moral, brave unto desperation. Don't bother your head with religious theories. Cowards only sin. Brave men never. No, not even in mind. If you are really pure, how do you see the impure? For what is within is without. We cannot see impurity without having it inside ourselves. This is one of the practical sides of Vedanta, and I hope that we shall all try to carry it in our lives. Doing good to others is virtue, is dharma. Injuring others is sin. Strength and manliness are virtue. Weakness and cowardice are sin. Independence is virtue. Dependence is sin. Loving others is virtue. Hating others is sin. Faith in God and in one's own self is virtue. Doubt is sin. Knowledge of oneness is virtue. Seeing diversity is sin. The watchword of all well-being, of all moral good is not I, but thou. Who cares whether there is a heaven or a hell? Who cares if there is a soul or not? Who cares if there is an unchangeable or not? Here is the world, and it is full of misery. Go out into it as Buddha did, and struggle to lessen it or die in the attempt. Forget yourself. This is the first lesson to be learnt. Whether you are a theist or an atheist, whether you are an agnostic or a Vedantist, a Christian or a Mohammedan, the one lesson obvious to all is the destruction of the little self and the building up of the real self. After so much austerity, I have understood this as the real truth. God is present in every jiva. There is no other God besides that. Who serves jiva, serves God indeed. These are his manifold forms before thee. Rejecting them, where seekest thou for God, who loves all beings without distinction? He indeed is worshipping best his God. You have read, Matri Deva Bhava, Pitri Deva Bhava. Look upon your mother as God, look upon your father as God. But I say, Daridra Deva Bhava, Murkha Deva Bhava, the poor, the illiterate, the ignorant, the afflicted. Let these be your God. Know that service to these alone is the highest religion. We want to worship a living God. I have seen nothing but God all my life, nor have you. To see this chair, you first see God, and then the chair in and through him. He is everywhere saying, I am. The moment you feel I am, you are conscious of existence. Where shall we go to find God if we cannot see him in our own hearts and in every living being? If in this hell of a world one can bring a little joy and peace even for a day into the heart of a single person, that much alone is true. This I have learnt after suffering all my life. All else is mere moonshine. If you want any good to come, just throw your ceremonials overboard and worship the living God, the man God, every being that wears a human form. God in his universal as well as individual aspect. The universal aspect of God means this world, and worshipping it means serving it. This indeed is work, not indulging in ceremonials. Millions of rupees have been spent only that the temple doors at Varanasi or Vrindavana may play at opening and shutting all day long. Now the Lord is having his toilet. Now he's taking his meals. Now he's busy on something else. We know not what. And all this while the living God is dying for want of food, for want of education. The Banyas of Bombay are erecting hospitals for bugs, while they would do nothing for men, even if they die. You have not the brain to understand this simple thing, that it is a plague with our country, and lunatic asylums are rife all over. Look upon every man, woman, and every one as God. You cannot help anyone. You can only serve. Serve the children of the Lord, serve the Lord himself. If you have the privilege, if the Lord grants that you can help any one of his children, blessed you are. Do not think too much of yourself. Blessed you are that the privilege was given to you when others had it not. Do it only as a worship. I should see God in the poor, and it is for my salvation that I go and worship them. The poor and the miserable are for our salvation, so that we may serve the Lord, coming in the shape of the diseased, coming in the shape of the lunatic, the leper, and the sinner. The first of all worship is the worship of the Virat, of those all around us. Worship it. Worship is the exact equivalent of the Sanskrit word, and no other English word will do. These are all our gods, men and animals, and the first gods we have to worship are our countrymen. These we have to worship, instead of being jealous of each other and fighting each other. This is the gist of all worship, to be pure and to do good to others. He who sees Shiva in the poor, in the weak, and in the diseased really worships Shiva. And if he sees Shiva only in the image, his worship is but preliminary. He who has served and helped one poor man seeing Shiva in him, without thinking of his caste or creed or race or anything, with him Shiva is more pleased than with the man who sees him only in temples. A rich man had a garden and 2 gardeners. One of these gardeners was very lazy and did not work. But when the owner came to the garden, the lazy man would get up and fold his arms and say, "How beautiful is the face of my master," and dance before him. The other gardener would not talk much, but work hard and produce all sorts of fruits and vegetables which he would carry on his head to his master, who lived a long way off. Of these 2 gardeners, which would be the more beloved of his masters? Shiva is that master, and this world is his garden. And there are 2 sorts of gardeners here, the one who is lazy, hypocritical, and does nothing, only talking about Shiva's beautiful eyes and nose and other features, and the other who's taking care of Shiva's children, all those that are poor and weak, all animals and all his creations. Which of these would be more beloved of Shiva? Certainly he that serves his children. He who wants to serve the Father must serve the children first. He who wants to serve Shiva must serve his children, must serve all creatures in this world first. It is said in the Shastra that those who serve the servants of gods are his greatest servants. So you will bear this in mind. Let me tell you again that you must be pure and help anyone who comes to you, as much as lies in your power. And this is good karma. By the power of this, the heart becomes pure, Chitta Suddhi. And then Shiva, who is residing in every one, will become manifest. And if a man is selfish, even though he has visited all the temples, seen all the places of pilgrimage, and painted himself like a leopard, he is still further off from Shiva. You are the highest temple of God. I would rather worship you than any temple, image, or Bible. Why are some people so contradictory in their thoughts? They say they are hard-headed, practical men. Very good. But what is more practical than worshipping here, worshipping you? I see you, feel you, and I know you are God. The only God to worship is the human soul in the human body. Of course, all animals are temples too, but man is the highest, the Taj Mahal of temples. If I cannot worship in that, no other temple will be of any advantage. The moment I have realized God sitting in the temple of every human body, the moment I stand in reverence before every human being and see God in him, that moment I am free from bondage. Everything that binds vanishes, and I am free. The next question is to know what comes after realization. Yet, religious realization does all the good to the world. People are afraid that when they attain to it, when they realize that there is but one, the fountains of love will be dried up, that everything in life will go away, and that all they love will vanish from them, as it were, in this life and in the life to come. People never stop to think that those who bestowed the least thought on their own individualities have been the greatest workers in the world. Then alone a man loves when he finds that the objects of his love is not any low, little, mortal thing. Then alone a man loves when he finds that the object of his love is not a clod of earth, but it is the veritable God himself. The wife will love the husband the more when she thinks that the husband is God himself. The husband will love the wife the more when he knows that the wife is God himself. The mother will love the children more who thinks that the children are God himself. That man will love his greatest enemy who knows that every enemy is God himself. That man will love a holy man who knows that holy man is God himself, and that every man will also love the unholiest of men because he knows the background of that unholiest of men is even he, the Lord. Such a man becomes a world mover for whom his little self is dead and God stands in its place. The whole universe will become transfigured to him. That which is painful and miserable will all vanish. Struggles will all depart and go. Instead of being a prison house where we every day struggle and fight and compete for a morsel of bread, this universe will then be to us a playground. Beautiful will be this universe then. Such a man alone has the right to stand up and say, "How beautiful is this world." He alone has the right to say that it is all good. This will be the great good to the world resulting from such realization, that instead of this world going on with all its friction and clashing, if all mankind today realize only a bit of that great truth, the aspect of the whole world will be changed. And in place of fighting and quarreling, these would be a reign of peace. This indecent and brutal hurry, which forces us to go ahead of everyone else, will then vanish from the world. With it will vanish all struggle. With it will vanish all hate. With it will vanish all jealousy. And all evil will vanish away forever. Gods will live then upon this earth. This very earth will then become heaven. And what evil can there be when gods are playing with gods? When gods are working with gods and gods are loving gods? That is the great utility of divine realization. Everything that you see in society will be changed and transfigured then. No more will you think of man as evil, and that is the first great gain. No more will you stand up and sneeringly cast a glance at a poor man or a woman who has made a mistake. No more will you think of jealousy and punishments. They will all vanish, and love, the great ideal of love, will be so powerful that no whip and no cord will be necessary to guide mankind aright. If 1/1,000,000th part of the men and women who live in this world simply sit down and for a few minutes say, "You are all God. Oh, ye men, and O ye animals and living beings, you are all the manifestations of the one living deity. The whole world will be changed in half an hour. Instead of throwing tremendous bombshells of hatred into every corner, instead of projecting currents of jealousy and of evil thoughts in every country, people will think that this is all He. He is all that you see and feel. How can you see evil until there is evil in you? How can you see the thief unless he is there, sitting in the heart of your heart? How can you see the murderer until you are yourself the murderer? Be good, and evil will vanish for you. The whole universe will thus be changed. This is the greatest gain to society. This is the great gain to the human organism. Bring all light into the world. Light, bring light. Let light come unto everyone. The task will not be finished till everyone has reached the Lord. Bring light to the poor, and bring more light to the rich, for they require it more than the poor. Bring light to the ignorant, and more light to the educated, for the vanities of education of our time are tremendous. Thus bring light to all, and leave the rest unto the Lord. For in the words of the same Lord, to work you have the right, and not to the fruits thereof. Let not your work produce results for you, and at the same time may you never be without work.
End of chapter 6. My India, the India Eternal by Swami Vivekananda. This is a Vivekananda Kendra Kanyakumari recording. All recordings of Vivekananda Kendra are in the public domain. For more information and also to volunteer, please visit www.vkendra.org.